Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander just recently spoiled from Zendikar Rising, Zareth San the Trickster. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description too. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Zareth is a 4/4 Merfolk Rogue with Flash for 3 generic, 1 blue and 1 black, already passing the vanilla test. Additionally, he also has an activated ability and a triggered ability. For 4 mana, you can return an unblocked attacking rogue you control to its owner's hand in order to put Zareth from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Now this is a great way to bypass commander attacks if you had a deck dedicated to unblockable rogues as well as bouncing Zareth. I found those hoops a bit too much to jump through, so I'm not going to focus on that ability in this brew. What I am going to focus on is his triggered ability. Being able to steal any permanent from an opponent's graveyard without having to spend any mana is amazing. Not only can you ramp by stealing lands, bonus points for stealing fetches, but you can also steal any fatty there or any amazing enchantment, mana rock, you name it. Now, in order to achieve this, Zareth should preferably be unblockable and opponents should have spicy things in their graveyard. That's why my brew is a combination of milling and Voltron. Since we need opponents to have things in their graveyard to steal, first let's see the milling aspect of the deck. Passively, we can mill opponents as a byproduct of drawing cards thanks to Psychic Corrosion, Sphinx's Tutelage, and Teferi's Tutelage. This might seem a bit slow, but the point of the deck isn't to win by milling, it is to get things into our opponent's graveyards to steal with Zareth. So getting these onto the battlefield early on will give us at least some opponent to go after with Zareth once we get him into the battlefield. Memory Erosion also passively mills opponents, this time whenever they cast a spell. Again, just like the previous enchantments, this won't mill an opponent anytime soon, but it is annoying and it does get cards into their graveyard with no effort on our end. Mind Crank is another passive mill effect, but this one has the potential to mill more cards than the previously mentioned enchantments. It also synergizes incredibly well with Zareth because of the Voltron strategy of the deck. So if Zareth takes quite a chunk of life away from the opponent, they will mill a ton of cards that are potential treasure for him. Additionally, Mind Crank combos with Bloodchief Ascension. Bloodchief Ascension is included in the deck as a way to also burn opponents whenever they get milled. That way, it's also easier for us to take out opponents with combat damage and or commander damage if they're also losing life when getting milled. However, when these two cards are combined and the Ascension is online, this creates an infinite loop. The way this works is that once Bloodchief Ascension is taking away life when opponents get milled, it will trigger Mind Crank, which mills opponents when they lose life. This then triggers the Ascension again, creating an inescapable loop if not dealt with. Sir Conrad the Grim is also included as a way to have opponents lose life when milled, but he is restricted only to creatures, so it might not necessarily guarantee the infinity like Bloodchief Ascension does. That being said, Sir Conrad pings all opponents regardless of who lost the creature, and he also does so regardless of where the creature came from, so he'll trigger whether the creature was killed or discarded as well as milled away. He's also a 5/4 for 5 mana, so he also has a relevant body. The final way the deck mills opponents passively is with Mesmeric Orb. Mesmeric Orb is such a back-breaking card, and I'm glad it got reprinted in Double Masters because it was getting quite expensive. Your opponents mill a card for each permanent they untap. We have to mill ourselves as well. Now, this deck isn't about using our own graveyard, so Ulamog the Infinite Gyre is included as a way to prevent our unintentional self-milling from getting out of control. It's also a huge beater with an excellent trigger upon casting, so it can also be used in the late game to close out the game. That being said, again, it's mostly to shuffle our graveyard back into our library. Jace's Memory Adept is almost a way to passively mill opponents, but we do have to activate him to do so. We can only do it once per turn, but at least he doesn't lose a loyalty counter to do so. But we do have to activate him, so it's not a passive ability. At least it doesn't require any mana to do so. Fleet Swallower and Nemesis of Reason also don't require any mana to use, but the best thing about their triggers is that it happens on attack, not on combat damage. So even if they manage to get blocked, the defending player still has to mill a significant amount of cards. Fleet Swallower in particular, since it mills half their deck rounded up. Jadek Lord of Secrets and Murkovosk Minddrinker on the other hand would have to deal combat damage to a player. In Jadek's case, he wouldn't deal the damage, he'd get way bigger and then mill a ton of cards. Murkovosk is interesting in that he has the potential to mill a ton of cards or whiff if the defending player had too many lands close together in their deck. As far as guaranteeing that these 4 creatures are able to be sent into combat with total abandon and not worrying about getting blocked, soon enough we'll see what the deck has for that, since it's also beneficial for Zareth. Sphinx Mindbreaker mills all opponents by 10 when it enters the battlefield. The deck doesn't have any blink hijinxes because there aren't any creatures with it to abuse it, but a 6/6 flyer with 7 mana isn't that bad. It can serve as a beater or blocker to relatively most threats. Either way, keep in mind that we'll be mostly using our opponent's stuff anyways. Phoenix, God of Deception, helps turn those fatties that aren't attacking and or used as blockers into ways of milling our opponents. On its own, Phoenix is, in my opinion, the best mill commander as of the recording of this video. If you want to see just how epic Phoenix is at actually winning you the game by milling out the entire table, you can check out my deck tech video for him in the link above. As far as him working here, at the very least, he can tap down to mill for 7 if he's a creature. Being indestructible also makes him an excellent blocker. This deck has few creatures and they're mostly for attacking, so we do need to have a couple of blockers up. Speaking of creatures that help further our mill strategy, look no further than Bruvak the Grandiloquent. Some may argue that he might be better than Phoenix, but running 40 plus persistent petitioners in a mono blue Bruvak deck is nowhere near as good as Phoenix, which also has access to black. But that's a topic for a different discussion. In any case, Bruvak is an excellent support piece since he doubles our milling effects. Unfortunately, he can't double Mirko Vosk's effect because it doesn't have the word mill, so even though you are technically milling, you're not literally milling as far as his effects are concerned. Sands of Delirium is a great mana sink for our untapped lands and mana rocks at the beginning of the end step before ours. Again, not the best card for a deck dedicated to milling, but milling is only a secondary strategy to this deck. We want some things milled in order to steal them with Zareth. Once we have enough goodies, everything else is just a bonus. The reason we're going to have so many untapped lands at the end of that turn is because we're keeping them available for our responses, which we'll see soon enough. And also because Zareth has flashed, so we can cast him at the end of the turn before ours. Traumatize and Mind Grind are the final ways we mill with the deck. Unfortunately, these aren't used multiple times like our permanents, but they do mill an insane amount of cards for not that much mana. Mind Grind mills all of our opponents until they milled X lands. Sorry, I shouldn't say mill because it's not worded that way on the card, so you can't use Bruvak with it. That being said, you can with Traumatize. In fact, casting Traumatize with Bruvak on the battlefield will immediately deck the hapless opponent. You can also do the same thing with attacking with Fleet Swallower while Bruvak is on the battlefield. Alright, so let's see how we're going to make Zareth dangerous since this deck is combining the Mill archetype along with the Voltron archetype. First, we have to make sure Zareth can get in and deal combat damage to use his ability. Fortunately, he has Flash, which is better than Haste in this case since we can cast him the turn before ours and then have all of our mana available and him without summoning Sickness. So in order to get in with him that turn, what better way than making him outright unblockable? Whispersilk Cloak and, to a certain extent, Prowler's Helm help in making Zareth unblockable. As an added bonus, the Cloak also gives him Shroud. Since these are cheaper than Zareth, we can get them on the battlefield before him and then equip him the turn after we flash him in. Thassa, God of the Sea, and Mu Yangling can also make Zareth unblockable. Yangling can do it for free with a positive loyalty ability, so that's a plus. Thassa does require mana, but at least it's just 2 each time to do so. But Thassa is very cheap to cast and she filters our draw each turn. She's also a 5/5 indestructible blocker when Devotion is met, so there's that too. As for Yanling, she can also draw cards in a pinch and her ultimate is pretty good too since we take an extra turn. Although that's a massive pro to running her, she's used mostly for the card draw and making a creature unblockable. Notice that these abilities can also be used in the previously mentioned mill creatures like Mirko Vosk, Jadek, Fleet Swallower, and Nemesis of Reason. Rogue's Passage can also make a creature unblockable, but it's quite expensive at 4 mana and tapping, which also deprives us of 1 mana. That being said, it is on a mana producing land that doesn't enter the battlefield tapped, so it doesn't take up a slot in the deck. However, the best way to make all of our creatures unblockable without paying any mana afterwards is thanks to Sun Quan, Lord of Wu. Once Sun Quan hits the board, all of our creatures gain Horsemanship. So unless any opponents are running any creatures with Horsemanship, our creatures are as good as unblockable. He's also a 4/4, so we can use him to apply pressure during combat too. We can also try making Zareth unblockable by giving him protection. The deck's running Sword of Body and Mind, Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice, and Sword of Sinew and Steel. I feel like these 4 swords are the best for the deck, so let's see why. Body and Mind mills that opponent by 10, so it already goes with the synergy of the deck. Getting the 2/2 Wolf token is just a bonus and at the end of the day, just another chump blocker. Green and blue are also the best colors to have protection from since they have the top colors in Commander. Feast and Famine is also the best kind of protection since green and black are also part of the top colors in Commander. In a vacuum, this sword is the best of all 7 printed so far. But in this deck, it's amazing because it makes an opponent discard a card, which is more goodies for us to potentially steal, and it untaps all of our lands, meaning we can play during our turn and then have those lands available for our responses during our opponent's turn. Fire and Ice give relevant protection against removal and burn while also dealing 2 damage to any target. We also draw a card from it, which is a great way to dig through our deck. Finally, Sinew and Steel also provides relevant protection against spot removal. It also destroys up to 1 planeswalker and or artifact that player controls, which, if we arrange our triggers correctly, can give us something to steal from them right away. And to top it all off, these swords give Zareth +2/+2. Putting them together makes him a 2-turn clock. However, we're not done. These triggers, as well as Zareth's, occur when dealing combat damage, so how about we make him deal combat damage twice? Fire Shrieker and Grappling Hook give Zareth double strike. On their own, they make Zareth a 3-turn clock, but that also has you steal 2 things per combat. However, he's also equipped with any sword. Having double strike makes those swords trigger twice, which is insane. Since we want to end games quickly, we do have the inevitable nombo of taking out an opponent whose stuff we're using. since we have to hit them to steal their permanent from their graveyard. Once they receive lethal commander damage, we lose those things. But that's just a sacrifice we have to make. So if we pump Zareth, he might potentially be a 2-turn clock or even a 1-turn clock if he has double strike. We can also duplicate his trigger without giving him double strike with Strionic Resonator. Unfortunately, we have to tap it to use its ability, but being able to steal 2 permanents from an opponent's graveyard by just paying 2 mana is too good to pass up. We can also copy any other trigger we have, such as the ones from our Saboteurs seen earlier. Whip of Herbals is also included in case we start getting too low on life. Giving our creatures lifelink, particularly a pumped up Zareth, will keep our life total sufficiently healthy in case we get attacked by creature-based strategies. Additionally, it can be used to reanimate any of our creatures for that turn, so if we lost any of our Saboteurs, we can reanimate them to get at least one more instance of value from them. As for dealing with creature-based decks and other wrenches in our plan, let's see what responses we have in the deck. Damnation almost always gets the job done as long as there aren't any indestructible creatures on the board. However, if there are any of them, Toxic Deluge, Dead of Winter, and Mutilate are included for good measure. Dead of Winter only hits non-snow creatures, but chances are that's going to be practically all of them until maybe the release of Kaldheim. In any case, the deck's running 12 fetchable snow lands, so it will do some work. Likewise, the deck is running Urborg, so Mutilate will also do some work. In any case, an overloaded Cyclonic Rift always gets the job done. What makes Cyclonic Rift even better in this deck is that if opponents had to discard down to maximum hand size because of it, that's more cards for us to potentially steal. The deck also has a decent suite of counter magic thanks to Pact of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, Force of Negation, Force of Will, Swan Song, Negate, Counterspell, and Mana Drain. The first 4 are potentially free ways of interrupting opponents from comboing off or winning the game. With the exception of Force of Negation, we can also try to free cast these during our turn to protect any of our own combos. The other 4 are still relatively cheap, so they're still great responses in the deck. Mystic Sanctuary is included as a way to recur any responses to the top of our library in a pinch since we can fetch for it, as well as a way to recover any mill spell we'd want to reuse. As to ensuring we have responses in our hand, we have to make sure to never run out of steam. Pull from the Tomorrow, Stroke of Genius, and Blue Sun's Zenith are given not just as instant speed mana sink at the end of the turn before ours, but to also draw into a ton of cards. Not only that, but if an opponent had a small enough library, we can also use the last 2 to deck them and eliminate them that way. Again, not the main focus, but it's good to know that these spells have multiple functions in the deck if it came to it. Rhystic Study has us draw a card whenever an opponent casts a spell without paying for the tax. It is an incredibly annoying spell, I know, but the more decks I brew and test out and play with, the more I find that green is actually becoming the best color for consistent and efficient card draw on permanents. If you would have told me that 20 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. In any case, that's a topic for a different discussion. Urbol's God of the Dead and Phyrexian Arena draws cards in exchange for life. Drawing 2 cards each turn with Phyrexian Arena is great for its mana cost. It also helps our devotion to black. Urbol's in the meantime is great for the deck since it prevents opponents from gaining life. We can also pay 2 life and 2 mana to draw a card, which is also good. It's also an indestructible 5/7 blocker when devotion is met. It can also mill 7 when tapped thanks to Phoenix, assuming he's a creature of course. Alhammar's Archive helps maximize our card draw apart from the first one in our draw step. It costs 1 more than Teferi's Ageless Insight, but I include the former over the latter because 5 generic mana is easier to cast and doesn't require we use 2 blue sources for it. It also doubles the life we gain. Granted, that only happens with Whip of Erebos, but it's still a better trade-off for mana than Teferi's Ageless Insight was. Not only do we want to draw a lot of cards in the deck, but we're running 3 enchantments that mill opponents when we do, so maximizing our card draw not only helps us, but hurts opponents as well. Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel are included so that we can keep our fat hand full of responses at the end of our turn. Either way, Reliquary Tower isn't a hindrance here since it's a 2-colored deck and it's a mana-producing land that doesn't enter the battlefield tapped. Thought Vessel is also a decent mana rock in its own right since it costs just 2 mana and doesn't enter the battlefield tapped. Speaking of mana rocks, the deck's running Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Soul Ring, Talisman of Dominance, Dimir Signet, and Arcane Signet. Mox Opal will achieve Metalcraft here without a hitch since the deck's running 23 artifacts in it. The last 3 might cost 2 mana to cast, but there's still decent acceleration in blue-black, especially since our commander costs 5 mana to cast, so it's not like we expect to have him out by turn 1 or 2 every game. Sword of the Animus and Burnished Heart are great ways to literally ramp for basic lands and are the few available ones in these colors, but they do get the job done. Especially the sword since we plan to attack with a creature every turn, so we get a basic on the battlefield each combat. As a bonus, it also pumps +1/+1 the creature is equipped to. Keep in mind also that lands are permanent, so we can also steal those with Zareth. As mentioned earlier, the deck's running Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, along with Cabal Coffers and Lake of the Dead, as ways to generate explosive bursts of black mana. Being able to generate a ton of black mana is a great way to sink into the X cost of our instant speed draw spells, as well as to sink into Sands of Delirium. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 8 fetch lands, Ancient Tomb, Temple of the False God, Underground Sea, Watery Grave, Sunken Hollow, Sunken Ruins, Morphic Pool, Drowned Catacomb, Underground River, and Command Tower, as well as 6 of each snow basic covered land. Keep in mind that these are incredibly useful for Dead of Winter. As with all of my deck techs, almost the entire budget is in the mana base, so if you're not playing online or don't already have them, then you can easily swap out Mana Crypt, Underground Sea, and the more expensive fetch lands for budget substitutes, and the deck will still run just fine. At least by this time next year, the enemy fetch lands will be reprinted in Modern Horizons 2, which isn't supposed to be a reprint set, but who cares, we're finally getting the fetch lands reprinted in a meaningful way in 2021. Unless the world ends in 2020, but we'll see what happens. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Zareth San the Trickster. I decided to go with a more casual brew since the deck is not only Mill but Voltron as well, which are two archetypes closer to the casual end of the Commander power spectrum. That being said, the deck is incredibly fun to play and to pilot, and in the right pod can be quite the contender, especially since it has multiple ways of winning and can steal your opponent's bombs for free. It can also win out of nowhere, whether with a complete Mill combo or one-shotting something with commander damage. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I'm Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.